Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
On today's episode, we're going to go off the beaten path slightly, you might say, to discuss a topic that has relevance well beyond waterfowl science and conservation. Our conversation today is going to revolve around the fundamental question of what's the deal with birds? Well, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. Really, the most important part of the conversation today is going to deal with something called predatory journals, what they are, and why it's important that we all be aware of them. To help us with this conversation, I'm joined on the phone by Dr. Dan Baldassarre, Assistant Professor of Zoology, State University of New York, Oswego. Dan, welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
Before we get into the topic, I want to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, where you are, and what kind of work you specialize in.
Yeah, so I am a second-year assistant professor up here in upstate New York. I'm at one of the SUNY universities here up in Oswego, and I study birds. I've been studying birds for most of my adult life, and I typically study bird behavior. I've done a little bit of work with waterfowl back in the day. I worked on brant up in the YK Delta in Alaska, which was a phenomenal experience. But I took a little bit of a diversion from there, and now I work mostly on songbirds and questions about mating systems and the evolution of communication in birds. So those are the sort of things that I tend to work with now. I spend most of my time research-wise now actually working on northern cardinals with a bunch of undergrad students up here in central New York.
We can't go very far into this conversation without acknowledging your connection to the waterfowl world. Students of waterfowl conservation and waterfowl ecology will recognize your last name, Baldassarre. And in fact, your dad was Guy Baldassarre. He is very well known in the ornithological field in general, but certainly within the waterfowl arena, there are numerous professionals within the waterfowl community, whether it be academia, conservation, or any state agency that have a connection back to your dad. And matter of fact, Ducks Unlimited's chief scientist, Dr. Tom Moorman, is a former student of Dr. Guy Baldassarre. And so if people are listening and they recognize that last name, it's not coincidence. You know, your dad, one of his final and most lasting, legacies in this field was the rewrite of Frank Belrose's Ducks, Geese, and Swans of North America. So just wanted to make sure people realize that you do have a connection to the waterfowl world, and that's great contributions that your dad made to this field.
Yeah, no, I'm very proud of my waterfowl heritage. As I said, I never got too far down the road of waterfowl research, but I was blessed to have all those connections and get to know a lot of people in the waterfowl world. And yeah, anybody who is remotely interested in learning more about the science of waterfowl, get your hands on that beautiful Ducks, Geese, and Swans of North America volume. It's definitely one of the works my dad was definitely most proud of, for sure.
Yeah, well, he did a great job of it. Dan, your name, we'll shift here to the topic of our podcast episode. Your name and a publication of yours has been in the media, social media, and broader media, quite frankly, a fair bit here lately. And it's around this topic of predatory journals. But it's when we normally think about a researcher's name and a publication of theirs receiving some notoriety, receiving a lot of publicity in the media, it's usually because there's some grand discovery or some significant finding that's been made by that researcher. But that's not necessarily the case in this particular instance. In some way it is, but what I'll try to set up this story here. I began following you on social media on Twitter a couple of months ago, And somewhere along the lines, I noticed a post of yours, and you noted that you had been receiving a lot of requests from this, quote, predatory journal here lately. And so you said, well, I decided to submit a manuscript and we'll see how it goes. So then you were able to allow your Twitter followers to follow this saga between you and this predatory journal as you submitted a manuscript to kind of see what they would do. So before we get into this, I'm going to let you sort of tell the story of how this came about. But let's start off. We got a little bit of groundwork on what are predatory journals in general. So let's start there. Tell our listeners what those are.
Yeah, so predatory journals are basically money-making scams that target the scientific community. So, as opposed to legitimate scientific journals where you submit a manuscript and they undergo a very thorough process of peer review and are very often rejected. And maybe if you're lucky and your research meets these very high criteria as decided by your scientific peers, your paper will be published by one of these journals and, able to be accessed by other scientists and by the public. And that's how you get your, scientific findings out to the world at large. What these predatory journals do is actually actively seek out scientists, often in very aggressive and relentless manners. And it's typically through, just blasts of spam emails. So anybody listening to this who has any sort of scientific communication will be familiar with the concept of their email inboxes just filling up with these spam emails. And so that's one of the red flags to these predatory journals, is that as opposed to a real legitimate journal where you need to decide as the researcher where you want to try and submit your work, and you need to seek that journal out and, sort of try and meet their approval and their peer review. These predatory outfits actively seek people out, and they often have this very strange sort of flowery praise in their emails of, along the lines of, it's come to our attention that you are a very eminent and prestigious researcher in your field, and we would be delighted if you would, add your contributions to our journal. And what happens is that you submit some, manuscript to one of these predatory journals, and there's a wide spectrum of things that can happen. But in general, these manuscripts that you submit are not subject to any sort of peer review. These are not legitimate scientific outfits that have, editors and reviewers that are, familiar with the research and are actually looking at these submissions. Instead, they'll take almost anything and quote unquote publish it for a fee, right? So it's a money-making enterprise where often very late in the process and through some sort of subterfuge and, hidden sort of ambiguous language, they will spring upon you, we will publish your manuscript, but for a couple $1,000s. And if you're unwitting enough to go along with the scam and fork over the money, maybe if you're lucky, they will quote unquote publish your paper on some sort of website. But again, these are not actual, peer reviewed journals. And it's very unlikely that, any reputable scientists are going to come across this work and sort of give it this, the same sort of legitimacy and attention that it would give if it went to a regular journal. So there, it's a pretty familiar sort of architecture to the scam, but it's sort of a niche thing in that it's really only targeted at scientists who are in the realm of publishing. So a lot of people outside of that world, aren't even really familiar with the existence of this kind of scam.
You've mentioned peer review process a couple of times here, and I want to make sure that we emphasize the importance of that. That's sort of the cornerstone for for what is the cornerstone for reliable scientific information that is out there, that we hope is out there. And so just give our listeners a thumbnail sketch of that peer review process and how it works. Who are the peers that do the reviewing? I know you and I have participated in this on both sides as both author and reviewer, but what's the significance of that peer review process?
Yeah, it really is a sort of very basic but really powerful framework for how we understand, how to trust scientific results and things that end up being communicated to the wider world that come from research. And, as opposed to, some shadowy board of, experts that, review everything in the world of science. What the scientific community has decided is that we sort of democratize that process, and your peers, literally your colleagues and the people with whom you are doing research, out there in the world, are the people that get sought out by the editors of these publications to look over your work, determine whether it meets, the certain standards of, rigor of science, whether you're, really adding new and important knowledge to the field. And they are the ones who, get the final say of, okay, this is reputable information. This was collected in an ethical and scientifically sound way, and we are going to let it get past this gate, this check of peer review, and let it get out to the wider world. So when Joe Public is opening up National Geographic and reads, some article about a scientific finding, he can know that it has passed some sort of filter of peer review that lends some credibility to it. So it's really how we know what to trust in terms of scientific results that get out into the broader community.
Yeah. This entire enterprise, scientific enterprise, is about reliable information that's that we can have confidence, as you've described, is collected and analyzed responsibly and rigorously, so that we know the information upon which we're making decisions is worth those kind of decisions. So it's not an easy process. Certainly, as you and I have gone through it. It does take time, and that's one of the beauties of it, is that yes, it's like this system of interdependent accountability. You're holding your scientific peers to account, for their rigor, and then they in turn hold you to account, as you've described. And so there are all sorts of journals that are available within which scientists publish their research, and we'll get a little bit later on to a discussion of how do you know which journals are predatory and which journals are not. But one of the key messages here is these predatory journals sidestep that critical review process. So a lot of the information that appears in these predatory journals is it's kind of suspect in some respect, or in worst cases, it's outright fabricated or false. And so that's what kind of brings us here to your little adventure with this journal. You wanted to, I think it's fair to say, see how far you could get with this and see how much they would allow you as a submitting author to get away with and kind of expose them. And so you penned this manuscript titled "What's the Deal with Birds?" And I have to read the abstract here just to kind of set up the hilarity of the situation. So here's your abstract. It says, many people wonder, what's the deal with birds? This is a common query. Birds are pretty weird. I mean, they have feathers. WTF? Most other animals don't have feathers. To investigate this issue, I looked at some birds. I looked at a woodpecker, a parrot, and a penguin. They were all pretty weird. In conclusion, we may never know the deal with birds, but further study is warranted. Of course, the final sentence there is great because so many scientific studies end up answering, a portion of the question, but it reveals as many questions on the outcome as we had going in, if not more. So anyway, that was the abstract that you submitted with this, and again, just emphasizes the hilarity of the manuscript that you submitted. But kind of walk us through what led you to want to do this and how you went about it.
Yeah. So, as you say, one of the motivations of this project was to sort of see what I could get away with submitting to one of these predatory journals. And so I thought, to me, one of the most sort of entertaining ways to try and do that would be to compose a just ridiculously, satirical and nonsensical manuscript. And I thought, that would also sort of make it more fun for people on social media to follow along. But the point embedded within that is that what I was submitting to this journal was completely devoid of any scientific merit or any kind of rigor or any meaning at all. And so if you submit something remotely close to that level of nonsense to a real journal, it will be detected and rejected immediately. And in contrast, if these predatory journals really are these scams, as I've described them, that are not interested in the content of the scholarship and just want to try and bilk money out of potential authors, they will be much more likely to, just accept complete nonsense. And so that is sort of how this saga ended up playing out, was that this predatory journal was completely thrilled and happy to accept this, my magnum opus here, What's the Deal with Birds, and try and extract some money out of me for it. And so I had a little bit of a back and forth and negotiations with the quote unquote editor of this publication, and they originally asked for something along the lines of $1,700 to publish this manuscript, which I wasn't willing to fork over just for the sake of this experiment, and ended up through negotiations convincing this editor to actually go ahead and format this paper in a really nice, beautiful, paragraph form with headers and everything that looks very nice and, official. So to the first glance, it looks like a completely legitimate scientific article, and they accepted it and they published it on their fancy looking website that, again, at first glance sort of looks like, a website that you would see from any other reputable journal. And they actually published this paper without managing to extract any money from me. But I think my assumption is that I'm now on their short list of scientists to continue to harass and harangue, because now that they've published a paper from me for free, maybe they think I'll be more likely to come back to them and try and submit something else, and they can extract some money from me. So that's sort of how the process played out in short form.
To your point here, Dan, I have a copy of the manuscript in my hand, and it looks professional, looks really well done. The formatting is great. It has a DOI number, a copyright indication, and it has a wonderful table where one of the columns has a WTF score. I love that one in particular for each of the variables that you supposedly measured. It has a wonderful figure of showing 3 species of birds that are positioned along this axis, which relates to the deal in terms of, what's the deal with birds, and particularly on the far left axis looks like a fish. Of course, you have the penguin representing that fish, and then the weird beak. You have a parrot and a woodpecker. So beautifully done figure there, Dan. But again, that just sort of contributed to the ridiculousness of what you were submitting, and yet it got through this supposed professional, scientific review process. You even made an acknowledgement to, I'm going to guess, one of your childhood heroes, Big Bird. We thank Big Bird from Sesame Street for comments on the manuscript and several trained monkeys.
That's right.
So great job in incorporating all those things. There are other aspects of this that you incorporated to try to trigger some sort of review that would trigger something in the review process that might get flagged and cause them to follow up or to reject the manuscript. One of which was straight out plagiarism of some previous work that you had published. A lot of times, as we've talked before, some of the journals will run submissions through some sort of automated review process to see if, or some indexing system to see if any language in the submitted manuscript is extracted or is plagiarized from another publication. That was the case in yours, but they didn't catch that either. So just totally bypassed any critical peer review. But otherwise, as you say, to someone that may not be as discriminating, publications of this type in these journals, now certainly not this one. I think most people would realize this was complete satire. But these things occur along a spectrum, and so otherwise seemingly legitimate studies could appear and do appear in some of these predatory journals, which brings us to kind of why this is important, why it's important to expose them. Number one, we want people to be aware that in the internet age, when there's so much information available at everyone's fingertips, it's really important, more so now than ever, to be a discriminating consumer of information, to try to understand where that information is coming from, and to be your own critical. Be your own best critic of the information that you're consuming, because presumably you're looking for that information to make some decision, whether it be about your health or any other kind of financial decision. So just want people to be aware that there are these unscrupulous actors out there that we can all fall victim to. In your case, or in the case of young, unsuspecting researchers who feel this pressure to publish. Incidentally, I love the hashtag that you incorporated on one of the first tweets, which was #publish or perish, which is something that a lot of people may not realize, is that, yes, professors and scientists do feel pressure to publish, either for job security or promotion or just their reputation. So there could be some unwitting young researcher that may not know that the journal they're publishing in is of this predatory nature, and then we as consumers of that information can also fall victim to that.
Yeah, it's right, and that's one of the things that fascinated me most about this experiment was, and one of the things I was most interested in trying to find out was sort of the lengths to which a predatory journal like this would go to appear legitimate. And this particular one, as you pointed out, really, dotted the I's and crossed the T's to the extent that, somebody who, is not as familiar with just trying to discriminate among, different publications and look for ones that are legitimate could very easily be duped by a journal like this. They have a very flashy looking website. They formatted the paper to look very legitimate. And so that really muddies the water for those of us who are trying to consume, reputable scientific research in terms of being able to figure out what we can trust and what we can't.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
We've talked about this paper a fair bit here, and so what I will do is tell our listeners that if you want to view this article, read it. It's certainly worth your time for a bit of humor. Just go online, and I'm sure it will come up if you search for "What's the Deal with Birds." It's worth a quick read, and clearly this one of the things that we have to do is make people realize that this was a brilliant move by your part to kind of to expose this. Use something as outrageous as what you composed here to illustrate this point. But I certainly want people to realize that when they read this paper with your name attached to it, this is an outlier in terms of, it's an extreme outlier. If this was done deliberately on purpose, you are a very accomplished scientist in your own right and have other publications in very respectable journals. So certainly, did you have were you worried at all about that, of doing something like this and then having your name attached to it, or were you comfortable knowing that it was so ridiculous that any person with an ounce of reason in them would realize what you were doing?
Yeah, it has been an interesting experiment in that regard, and it sort of depends on the audience, right? So, most of my academic colleagues are sort of already in the loop. They sort of get the joke from the jump because they're familiar with these predatory journals. But there is the sort of risk of actually attaching my name to this completely nonsensical, satirical publication that people don't totally get the joke. But to me, that's sort of the point, right? I mean, that sort of murky gray area where you don't know what to believe when you see, a publication like this pop up, in your internet browser. Is this a joke? Is this real? Is this legitimate? The various actors who are involved in this process, how much were they, in the know? Who's scamming who? That's sort of the, one of the interesting things about this whole thing is that it's difficult to know who's on the up and up and who isn't with these sort of predatory journals, and they take advantage of that. The sort of muddiness and the sort of gray area. So to a certain extent, I sort of by putting myself out there into that universe, I'm sort of at the whim of that kind of ambiguity. But, I've been happy to see that the vast majority of people sort of get the joke, while also understanding that, we're trying to sort of shed light on a legitimate problem in science. So I think it's been effective to that extent.
Dan, what's your best advice to people? We've talked a lot about the existence of predatory journals and the problem with them, but we've also acknowledged that in this day and time, people can go on their phones. Heck, they don't even have to be sitting down at a laptop. On their phone, they can search for information on the topic du jour for them, and they will get information back. What advice can you provide, especially when we start talking about searching for results from specific scientific journals? What kind of advice can you give people in terms of knowing whether the journal they're looking at or the article they're looking at is in fact reputable? Are there any places that list these predatory journals?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And that's in many ways the most important question, right? Is how do we sniff these things out? How do we know what to trust and what not to? And there are many people over the years who have made some really admirable attempts to sort of catalog all these predatory journals. The problem is, as you might imagine, in the internet age and with all of the motivations to try and make money on various scams, it's almost impossible to keep track of it all. I mean, the tentacles that are out there, throughout cyberspace are just so vast that these journals are constantly, changing their names and blinking in and out of existence. So that's really difficult to do. What is easier to do is just to sort of look at these papers with a little bit, of a sort of discriminating eye and look for things like, really obvious grammatical errors and typos and things like that. Oftentimes, if you read the first couple sentences of some of these submissions, you'll be able to detect that something is amiss for those sorts of reasons. The other thing is to pay attention to the source of the information, right? So who sent you this particular article that you're looking at? And does that person have any particular, scientific knowledge or insight that would, lend them some credibility, or did you, is it something that was forwarded to you on an email chain from your, grandmother? That might be something you might want to, pay a little bit closer attention to. And the other thing that can help is that reputable journals are often very obviously affiliated with, scientific organizations or societies that you'll be familiar with, right? So, for example, in the bird world, the sort of gold standard journal for us is the AUK, right, which is affiliated with the American Ornithological Society. And these sort of nebulous predatory journals don't have any of those connections, right? They're not connected to any sort of scientific societies. And they often have very sort of ambiguous, nonsensical names, right? The Journal of Scientific Research and Insight, just off the top of my head, that, looks like something that you would sit down and type up if you were just trying to come up with a random quasi-scientific sounding journal name. So those are some of the things that you can try and pay attention to.
And like the article or the journal title for where your article here is the Scientific Journal of Research and Reviews. I mean, that's beautiful. It sounds completely legitimate and scientific, to the nth degree, right? Can't get much more scientific than a Scientific Journal of Research.
Yeah, exactly. But it also says, nothing at the same time, right? So it's
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And, the last thing that I'll say is that, along this particular line is that, often when the general public is, getting access to scientific information, they're very rarely actually reading the journal article that, describes the research, right? So we're much more likely to, get our information from, the Ducks Unlimited magazine or National Geographic or something, right? And those, publications are trying to communicate obviously reputable scientific information, and they are, those stories are written by journalists that get their information from these scientific publications. So one thing I always encourage people to do is when they read some interesting headline or some story in one of these popular, science publications, is to actually look for the journal article that the author of the publication is referencing, and that will help you sort of get past the initial potential confusion and actually see, okay, what is the journal article off which this piece of popular science is based. And even if you don't have the technical knowledge to really understand all the details of the journal article, you can at least go to the extent of seeing, okay, where was this published? Was it published in a journal that sounds legitimate? Was it published in Science or Nature or the AUK? Or was it published in one of these, questionable other journals? And that can help you, figure out what to sort of believe when you're, reading your scientific magazines.
Fortunately, as it relates to Ducks Unlimited and our waterfowl management enterprise and natural resource management in general, certainly in North America, I've not seen very many instances of where these predatory journals will be making significant inroads within our community. Most of the work that I'm familiar with in the waterfowl arena and other ornithological disciplines here in North America ultimately gravitate to the more legitimate peer-reviewed journals and those the publications that they put out. At least that's been my experience. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, these are really, exceptions and not the rule, right? I mean, the vast majority of things that you will read out there, especially if it's from a publication that you trust and has, a big heritage to it. And sometimes these just outwardly nonsensical predatory journals really are sort of a dead end for information. It is sometimes difficult for them, as you say, to make inroads out into the sort of broader community. But it does happen. And especially with, some of these journals that are a little further along the spectrum to legitimacy, right? They may have a better chance of actually getting these publications sort of out into the wider world. So it is something that, people should be aware of, and just, in terms of the sort of broader question of, just questioning and being skeptical where this scientific information comes from. But I do agree with you that, just complete outright nonsense is not likely to end up in, the pages of National Geographic. But it is, it's something we want to be aware of.
Right. And so those would be the two key take homes for people here, is that, make sure you're aware of this. There are unscrupulous actors out there that are trying to take advantage of our desire to publish scientific or quote scientific work, as well as our desire to kind of consume that scientific information. So just be thoughtful, be critical of the information you're reading, and all the things that Dan has mentioned here. The other is that hopefully you have some faith and trust in Ducks Unlimited and other managers of our natural resources in North America, and just in knowing that we are aware of this phenomenon, and we do our part to make sure the information that we're using in the decisions that we make and that our partners make does not come from these predatory journals. So those would be two key take homes for you. Dan, anything else that you would like to add?
Yeah, I think the sort of other side of this coin is that not only the people on the consuming end of the spectrum who are sort of reading science and trying to determine if it's reputable need to be aware of this, but people who are producing the information, right? People like myself and those who are in the research community. We also have to do our part, right? It shouldn't just be up to Joe Public at home to have to sift through all this nonsense that's out on the internet and determine what to trust, right? To some extent, those of us who are producing the research, we have to take some personal responsibility as well, to seek out these unscrupulous publications and not feed them any of the ammunition that they use to keep these scams going. So I think that's important to point out, is that we have some responsibility as researchers as well to try and put a stop to this.
Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share with us your experience about this, about the existence and your exploits to expose at least one of these predatory journals, and to do so in a very entertaining and comic way in the process. We, as you said, we learned a little about what the deal is with birds, but we may never understand it all. But hopefully we're at least a little bit smarter about the existence and the way that these predatory journals act. So Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
You got it, Mike. Thanks a lot for having me.
A special thanks to our guest on today's show, Dr. Dan Baldassarre, Assistant Professor of Zoology from the State University of New York, Oswego. We appreciate him taking the time to share with us his experience, his humor, and teaching us all about some important information about a couple of topics. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great job that he does in getting these podcasts edited and out to you, our listeners. And to you, our listeners, we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.